everybody. It's Wednesday, so that means another chapel day here at Rehoboth Christian High School. I do promise that one of these days you'll have a different background for my chapel, that I'll record it outside or something, but for now you'll just have to see me in front of the computer again. But wanted to say welcome back, and that if you remember from last time, we said that this month, kind of during the month of September, we are going to be discussing some of the different people groups that shaped the culture and the time around when Jesus came, so that we can better understand what his life and ministry were all about. And last time we talked about a couple different practices. The practice of synagogue that arose out of the time that the Jews were in Babylon, this notion where they said, man, we want to dedicate ourselves back to the text, back to Torah, learning and understanding what God has for us as his people, what he has laid out for us as our path to live, the laws he wants us to follow, and so on. And then we also talked about Hellenism, this other total different worldview brought around by Alexander the Great, who was this amazing Greek conqueror and had the biggest empire the world had ever seen at that time. And the way he got his empire to stick is he brought in this new philosophy, this new idea, and this idea that Hellenism says, it's all about me. It's all about what I want, my comfort, all of that kind of thing. And Alexander the Great said, if you give me education, if you give me healthcare, if you give me entertainment, and if you give me athletics, and I can kind of embed those into the different cultures of the places that we've conquered, I promise you that they're going to come around and want to be part of our way of life. So that's what was happening around the known world at that time. And the area that Israel was, Judea, as it was called back then, was no exception. He certainly brought that worldview and that idea then. But of course, Alexander the Great didn't live forever. He died, and as he was on his deathbed, he split up his kingdom 4 ways, his empire. And the person, after a little while, who ended up running kind of or working with the part of the empire that held Judea was a guy named Antiochus. And Antiochus also believed in Hellenism, but he was much more aggressive about it than Alexander the Great was. He didn't just say, I'll just give it time, it'll work, they'll come around. He wanted to vigorously remove the practices of other religions within the empire. So for the people of Israel, that meant he wanted to remove their Judaism. He wanted to take away their temple practices in the Temple of Jerusalem and so on. So he sent people in there to throw the priests out of the temple, to take over, and he even sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple. Now, if you know anything about Jewish law, pigs were considered an unclean animal. You would never sacrifice a pig. And it was let alone eat one or touch one or anything like that. So that was like a direct slap in the face to God as the faithful Israelites felt. And so a group of them led by a guy named Judah Maccabee, rose up, and against this huge, powerful empire, they staged a revolt. And they actually ended up driving those people out of the temple, out of Jerusalem, and became kind of self-governing for a while. One of the few times in Israel's history that they were able to rule and govern themselves was during about this 100-year stretch called the Maccabean period, or the period that's named after the Maccabees, Judah Maccabee and his followers. That time when they drove the empire out of the temple, that is the reason that Jews celebrate Hanukkah. That's around Christmas time. It's a 8-day celebration there that says, hey, this is when we regained control of our temple. This is when we dedicated it back to God, and for that we're thankful. So that was all kind of the historical backdrop of what got back from the time of Hellenism first coming in from Alexander the Great a little closer to the time of Jesus. So those Maccabeans, after they had taken over or kicked out the empire again from Israel and allowed Israel to govern itself, they said, when God established our nation, our kingdom, he wanted it done a certain way. And one of the things he wanted is that priests would be the rulers, that priests would be the people who showed us the way to go, not just religiously, but also in terms of government and so on. So we want to give the power of Israel back to the priesthood. And so that priestly group was from the tribe of Levi. And there was a particular kind of two families within that tribe that they were deciding who should kind of take over and be the high priests. And the family that sort of won out in the discussion were the people who were the descendants of a man named Zadok. His descendants are called the Zadokim, the people of Zadok. Well, in English, when we say Zadokim, we say the word Sadducee. So the Sadducees are a group of people that you hear a lot about during Jesus' time and in his ministry. And that group of people is the first group that we're going to talk about today, the Sadducees. And that Sadducee group was this priestly group of people. They were the people who the Maccabees handed control of Israel back to. And they said, now you please govern us and rule us in the way that God intended. And for the first 20 to 30 years, that worked out okay. But then what happened is that the comforts, the joys of Hellenism, the power that came with that ruling started to influence and corrupt those Sadducees. And so instead of ruling Israel the way that God had wanted them to, they leveraged the religious practices, the political power for their own benefit, especially for their financial gain and their financial benefit. So for instance, there was one temple in all of Israel, and that temple's in Jerusalem. And God had commanded the people at certain times of the year during certain festivals or celebrations that they had to come to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices and participate in these times of worship and celebration. And so the Sadducees would set up a system that said, okay, we know that for Passover, you have to bring a lamb to sacrifice. Well, we are going to inspect the lamb that you have brought to make sure that it's completely without blemish and up to the standards of being sacrificed. And if it's not, you can buy one of our lambs that we have raised specifically for this purpose. Well, you can imagine that if you are controlling all the lambs that get purchased, you're not going to say that the outside lambs are up to standard, so to speak. So they would charge exorbitant prices for these sacrificial animals, and then they would make money off of it, knowing that the people had nowhere else they could go. There was only one temple, and the people didn't want to stop being Jewish, even though they knew it was corrupt, what the Sadducees were doing. So they kept on with the practice, and that just allowed the Sadducees to get richer and richer and richer. So that's kind of the situation that was in the lives of the Sadducees. Now, within that group, there was a smaller group called the chief priests. And the chief priests were a group of 7 families. And families were pretty big during these days, extended families and so on. So you're probably talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 100-ish people that were the chief priests, the main power brokers, almost like a kind of a mafia family within this Sadducee group that really held and controlled the reins tightly. So they did that in the temple, and they did that through the form of government. In the government of the Jews at this time, there was something called the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was composed of about 72 people. About half of them were Sadducees, these priestly people, and the other half were composed of Pharisees, who we'll read about later. We'll not read about, but I'll tell you about them in a future chapel. And that group was the idea they would make these kind of policy governing kinds of decisions for Israel. Now, that was the public Sanhedrin. There was also kind of a private Sanhedrin that was really run by this family of these families of the chief priests. And they would meet within the house and within the courts of the high priest of the whole Sadducees. And basically whatever that group decided the rest of the larger Sanhedrin had to abide by or had to also promote. And if they didn't, they would pay with their lives. These Sadducees had assassins that would go after people who disagreed with them and so on. And that's what they would do to anyone who didn't abide by what the Sanhedrin said. So these Sadducees, as you can see, had a great deal of power. And as the time of Rome came along, they decided, you know what, we don't want to lose this power to this new advancing empire, the Empire of Rome. So we want to figure out a way that they'll let us stay in power. And so what they did is they found a man and they offered one of their daughters, their kind of, you would say maybe a Sadducee princess, to marry him. And they said, if you marry this girl, you will become an honorary Jew, and then we would like you to be our king. And that man that they offered that to, his name was Herod. History knows him as Herod the Great. He was by far the richest man the world has ever known. By far. People like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, who are very rich today, multi-hundred over billionaires, they would have like mowed Herod's lawn, basically, if you convert how much he was worth into what they're worth today. And so this man got his wealth through controlling the entire spice trade of the whole world. And any kind of trade that happened during the world at this time had to come through the area of Judea. If you were coming from Asia and wanting to go to Europe, if you were coming from Europe wanting to go to Asia, it all came through this narrow strip of land. And so the main source of income and money and wealth at this time was through these spices that grew on different trees all around the world. And Herod basically owned all of those trees and controlled that whole trade. So everywhere in the entire world that spices were bought or sold, he was getting a piece of that, so to speak. It's estimated that during his life, about 60% of the people of Israel worked for him. That was by far the largest company in the world. There were about 6 million Jews at the time. You take away children, you're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 3 million people working for Herod in various capacities. And so what he did with all that wealth is he wanted to create environments for himself and for the people who followed him that were the best, the biggest, the most fancy, the shiniest, all that kind of stuff. And we specifically see that in a few of the different palaces. He made over 45 different palaces throughout Judea, but 3 main ones were kind of his crown jewels. One of those was almost like the size of a city right on the Mediterranean Sea. And that city is still there today. It's called Caesarea. Some people call it Caesarea Maritima. Maritime is a word for sea and ocean stuff. Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the sea. He built that just to impress Caesar. Caesar is in the name Caesarea. And this was a city that had the largest athletic stadium on the planet at that time. You could seat over 100,000 people in this huge stadium that spread on for almost a mile in each direction. And it had a huge open floor. And they would flood that stadium and reenact naval battles inside of it. They would have Olympic type games or gladiatorial type contests in there. It was this massive athletic gathering. Again, really promoting these ideas of Hellenism. It also had an enormous theater. We see the ruins of it still today. They've done a lot of restoration now, adding other seats. They even have concerts and shows there today. But the main bones of that are this theater that Herod built. Herod was also incredibly smart. He was this engineering type person, and he figured out, no one still knows to this day how he figured it out, but he figured out how to pour concrete and how to pour concrete even underwater to make these kinds of columns and structures that could come right out of the ocean. And we see in one part of Caesarea still today that he created a freshwater swimming pool that went out into the ocean with the saltwater ocean all around it and this fresh pool inside. And we still see the ruins of that today. And Herod didn't even like water. He considered himself a desert man. But yet, because that was a sign of wealth and a sign of power, he wanted to create all of these kinds of environments. So Caesarea was one of those huge palace areas. Another one was not too far from Jerusalem, right outside the town of Bethlehem where Jesus was born. And that palace is called the Herodium. The Herodium. And Herod decided in that area, you know what? I want something that gives me a good vantage point to look down over everything. And if I'm coming near Jerusalem, I want to be able to stay here and have a view of the city. And so he said, you know what? There's no hills or mountains around here. Build me a mountain. And so people just had to haul in all this dirt by hand. They didn't have earth movers or big machines or anything like that. And they built a mountain for this palace to stand on top of. And this palace ultimately has the tomb where Herod was buried, actually. It was covered with shiny white plaster so that it would gleam from afar when you saw it. Caesarea was covered that way as well. And so was all of the famous palaces that Herod made. But this would just give it this extra something special. And again, when he knew one day that someone important was going to come visit, he built a special theater on the side of the mountain for him. It was a massive opulent palace, and you're seeing some pictures of the different structures of the Herodium now as well. And then the third big palace we want to talk about is called the palace at Masada. And this was way out in the desert, overlooking the Dead Sea up on a high cliff. And this was sort of like an escape getaway kind of palace for Herod. Herod was super rich, but he was also very paranoid. He did not treat people well. He was brutal. He was violent. He didn't have any patience for people who disagreed with him. And so he was always worried that people weren't going to like that, or they were going to try to rebel, try to kill him, something like that. And so he wanted a place where if he got wind of any of those kind of plans, he could take off and get to this escape place, and then from there get across into the country of Idumea, or the country of Edom, today the modern day country of Jordan, which was kind of his homeland, that he could get away from there. And this would be a stop along the way. So he built this massive fortress on top of a mountain called Masada. And again, covered with shining white plaster so that it would gleam like a jewel in the sun from far, far away. This place had 7 swimming pools in the top of it. It took about 5,000 or 10,000 people just to live there and keep it up and keep everything clean and running, so that if and when Herod ever came to visit, he would have a place to stay that would be up to his standards. There was enough supplies, enough water, and enough food for 10,000 people to live for 10 years up there if they were ever under siege or anyone was ever trying to take it over. So he, again, was really planning for that. The way he did that, there were massive storage rooms full of food. When they were excavating this area, the archaeologists found big rooms with sealed jars. This is like 1,000 years later or more. And when they opened it, those jars had been sealed so well that the figs and the dates inside were still fresh and good to eat. And there are these massive cisterns up there. A cistern is, that's not a well, but it's a big, huge storage area for water. Of the world's biggest cisterns, 9 of them are on Masada. There's 17 altogether, and 9 of the biggest cisterns in the world are on Masada, holding, over 1.4 million square feet of water just in one. I mean, you could drive huge buses in these things. I mean, they're absolutely enormous. And so these palaces, these physical structures, are just one sign of the massive wealth that Herod had. And when he came in as the king of Israel at that time, he was able to offer his massive wealth combined with the power of Rome to Caesar and say, hey, I can keep this area under control for you. I can make sure that nothing gets out of hand in this place that is really literally the crossroads of the world. It's super important land. I'll take care of it for you. You've got the power. I've got the wealth. Let's team up. And that was exactly the plan that the Sadducees had, because Herod being in control allowed them to stay in their control of the people of Israel. And so when Herod came into power, he auctioned off to the Sadducees the high priesthood. He said, whichever one of you wants to pay the most will be the high priest. And that is not the way that God set it up when he first ordained the priesthood for Israel. But a man named Annas won that bidding, and he became the high priest of the Sadducees. And he built a house for himself in Jerusalem that had 17 bedrooms, and it went from one side of the street up and over the other side of the street. And it's probably in that house that Jesus came and was tried during the time of his crucifixion. They've just uncovered those ruins recently in Jerusalem. So that was the Sadducees, held in power kind of by Herod. The other group that we're going to talk about today is a group called the Herodians. The name Herod is in Herodians, so you can imagine that these people are getting their name because they're fans of Herod. They're fans of what he's about. And really what it is they're fans of Hellenism. They like the comfort that Hellenism provides. These weren't people who said, you know what, we're out. We don't want to love God. We don't want to be Jews anymore. They still wanted to practice their Jewish faith, but they thought, what's wrong with adding a little bit of Hellenism in there? What's wrong with a little fun? Did you hear that amazing lecture over at the gymnasium the other day? Did you see that awesome new play? Did you see that beautiful artwork that was put up on that building, those marble columns, those mosaics? And man, how nice is it to have running water and all of that kind of stuff? They thought we can still worship God and have this more comfortable kind of life. That was their approach. And these people, they lived some in the city of Jerusalem. These were not priests or anything like that. They were regular Jewish people. And they lived some in Jerusalem, but also some up in the Galilee region, closer to where Jesus did most of his ministry. In the Galilee, they lived kind of along the western shore. The modern day city of Tiberias is one of theirs, but extending all the way out kind of toward where Nazareth is, which was Jesus' hometown, in those areas there. And to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what sort of the compromise of the Herodians was about, we're going to look at some pictures from a town called Sepphoris. Zippori is another name for it. And in this town, it was in the middle of kind of pretty hardcore Jewish country up in there in the Galilee region. But this town was really kind of an evidence of all the things of Hellenism and of Rome that had taken root. So you had this beautiful paved streets in this town. Most towns didn't have that. You had a big, huge marketplace. Most towns didn't have that. You had enormous houses and homes where people lived. Again, most towns didn't have that. And some, again, with 25 plus rooms in this thing and just very opulent kind of artwork. So what you're going to see is some pictures here from a place called the Nile House, which is in Zippori, in Sepphoris here. And this place had some very amazing mosaics all over the floor. Now, Jewish people traditionally believe that you were not supposed to create images of things. You wouldn't see pictures of actual living things, whether that was animals or people or stuff like that. So they did these very intricate kind of geometric designs. And this is in the kind of more public meeting rooms. You might think about it as a living room. These are the floors in this place. Very beautiful, as you can see. And each one of those designs is made up of very small stones in this kind of mosaic pattern as they go. But as you progress further into the house, into kind of the more personal areas, the more intimate areas of the house, you start to see those mosaics change a bit. So looking now into an area that was a dining room, this floor had, they would say, probably about 20 million pieces of stone on it to make the big mosaic. The face of the woman you see there at the bottom, that is called the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. It was a beautiful picture of probably the woman whose house this was. And the rest of it, you see kind of that rectangular shape around it. That's because during this time when you have a big party, there was a kind of a U-shaped, horseshoe-shaped table that would sit there called a triclinium, a three-sided table like that. And the people would lay down at that table and eat, and they'd kind of lay on their side. But in the middle was an open space, and that middle you see all those different scenes depicted there. And so not only were there images, clearly you see images of people and so on, But the images that were depicted, especially in the middle here, now are really celebrating some of these Roman and Greek gods of the time. And specifically the god of wine and orgy. That god is portrayed in there. And so that would be someone who clearly would go against the values that God had made for his people. And there's another god there, Pan, who is depicted in some of those. And that he is the god of sexual fertility. And really the pictures depicting Pan and Pan worship and the festival of Pan that are in that mosaic, that would almost be considered kind of like softcore pornography at this time. So you're thinking now about these people who say, yes, I love God. I want to serve him. I want to follow all my Jewish traditions. But, what's wrong with a little Pan worship? What's wrong with just looking at it? What's wrong with those kinds of pictures? And so you see that kind of influence creeping into the Herodian people. So let's look back again at those two groups. You had the Sadducees. And in some ways you'd say, well, God did ordain priests to lead his people. So that priestly role was a necessary role for people to fill. So that could have been something really good. But what got corrupted was their thirst for wealth and power and the way that they used religion to accomplish that at the expense of the true worship of God for his people. And then you've also got the Herodians. And something to their credit, God wanted his people. The reason God put Israel where it was is because it was kind of this crossroads of the earth that he knew so many nations and peoples would come through this area as they traveled on the different trade routes and so on. And the idea was, as people come through, my people will engage with them. They'll share the knowledge of me and of my ways with these people and influence the whole world. And so that idea of engaging culture, that is something that God wanted from his people from the very beginning. And the Herodians had a perfect opportunity to do that. They knew about theater, they knew about art, they knew about learning and study and all of these things. They could have really done a good job engaging that. But instead of holding on tightly to their identity in the Lord, what they did is they let those influences of the world impact them in a way that turned their testimony, their witness, sour. It made it unfaithful to who God really wanted them to be. And those are people that you'll see Jesus interacting with. The Herodians are mentioned a few different times in Jesus' ministry. And the Sadducees we often lump together with another group called the Pharisees, who we'll learn about next time. But the Sadducees, really Jesus only spent about 1 week of his life interacting with them, and that was the last week of his life. And it's his rebuke of them, his teachings of them that caused the Sadducees to say, wait a minute, this guy is threatening our livelihood, our power, our comfort, our way of life. We got to get rid of him. And it's really those chief priests who kind of led the charge to have Jesus crucified and to do away with him. So those are the first two groups of people that we're talking about, the Sadducees and the Herodians. And then next time we'll cover another couple groups of people, and we've got one more to go after that. So as we leave today, I'd like you to think about a couple different things. I'd like you to think about what is it about these people that you can kind of see maybe in your own life resonating a little bit. Do you have times where you say, I know what God wants for me in my life, but man, do I sure like some of the TV shows or movies that I watch that I know probably aren't the best, or the music that I listen to. It's really hard for me to let go of some of those things. Then maybe you have some of these Herodian influences in you. If you're someone who says, boy, I like it when I'm in charge and I can kind of use other people to my benefit. Maybe you would have some part of you that would resonate a little bit with some of the Sadducee views. And so as we go through these different elements, I want us to look at and think about, as Jesus later gives his messages to these different groups of people, what parts of us is he speaking to in those moments as well? All right, if you'd please pray with me now. Lord, once again, we're thankful for a chance to learn about the life and world that your son Jesus came into. We're so thankful for the gift that he is to us, the means to our release and our salvation. And we thank you, and we want to honor you by learning and studying that in a lot of depth as we go through these next weeks. And so help us to think today critically about what parts of our lives might be being influenced by the world around us instead of us turning and changing the world for you. Help us to instead approach things in that very way, to say, how can we transform the world around us? How can we be shapers of the world for you and in your name? And equip us to do that today and every day. It's in the name of Jesus, the one who we're learning about, the one who we love, our very Savior, Jesus Christ, that we pray all these things. Amen. Go in peace and have a great day.